Hello there. Welcome to my review of the Rockford Files Season 1, Episode 6 and 7. Maybe. Not to get too bogged down with the technical details, but this was originally broadcast as one 90-minute episode, then split into two for syndication with some extra footage added. Unfortunately for me, this means it's credited as Episode 6 and Episode 6 and 7, depending on where you look. And the Rockford Files would have a mix of two-part episodes and feature-length episodes, so this happens many times. So, to make things easy, let's just call this Episode 6. The episode is titled, This Case is Closed, and was written by Cannell and Huggins, and directed by Bernard L. Kowalski. Our first new Columbo connection, as Kowalski directed 4 Columbo episodes. This episode begins with shots of LAX, dominated by the theme building, which resembles a flying saucer. It features in almost every episode of the Rockford Files that visits LAX, and originally contained a restaurant, although there hasn't been one there since 2013. This extended sequence of scenes of a plane landing gives a first hint that this 90-minute episode features a little bit of filler. But it isn't too long before we see Jim, having just got off a plane, phoning Warner Jameson, played by acting legend Joseph Cotton, known for, amongst other things, Citizen Kane and The Third Man. Jameson is Jim's client, and he's checking in to report on his return and mysterious goings-on.
Something happened back there. A little weird, but I'll fill you in.
It's a bit unusual that we only briefly see Jameson and don't hear him speak at all at this point, but maybe I'm the only one that noticed this. As Jim leaves the airport car park, he's followed. I do wish I could tell you the various makes and models of cars featured in each episode, but unfortunately I'm not a car guy, and American cars from the 70s is particularly challenging for a novice like me. So if you do know what Rockford's follower is driving, please do let me know in the comments. It's not long before Jim notices this tail, and a car chase ensues. This too feels a little stretched unless you really like looking at parked cars, but eventually Jim gets the better of his follower, only to return home to find his trailer has been turned over. We also get our first downside to unnaturally extending the episode here, as the guy who Jim caused to have 4 blowouts seems to have some kind of self-inflating tyres, or carries 4 spares, as we see him drive out of the parking lot Jim got him stuck in with ease in a scene that really doesn't need to exist. Jim uses some cunning and a lot of charm to finesse the name of the owner of his Tails car from a licensing clerk. Using the latest in computer technology, she's able to give him the name Martin Fishback and an address, but before he can act on this information, he's grabbed by 2 goons. Muscled into a car and driven to the house of Torrance Beck, a thoroughly unpleasant man.
The only question is whether you're going to wake up tomorrow breathing air or dirt.
Left alone to contemplate his own mortality, we get a flashback from Jim as to how this all started, as we see Sharon Gless's Susan Jameson at a party, and get another Columbo crossover, as the party appears to be happening in the Columbo episode Any Old Port in a Storm. Somehow, missing Columbo, Jim's companion at this party points out a Mark Chalmers, played by Jeffrey Land, before being introduced to Lauren, played by Robert Carnes, who also appeared in Columbo in the Greenhouse Jungle and candidate for crime, although sadly not any old port in a storm. He's then approached by the pre-Cagney and Lacey Glass, who asks,
"Are you really a private detective?"
Well, you must be mistaken. I'm a corporate profile analyst.
which he denies because he's in the middle of privately detecting. In this extended flashback, Jim then heads to the Jameson Ranch to meet with Warner Jameson, who has employed Jim to spy on Mark Chalmers and his fiancée, Susan Jameson. The combative relationship between Jameson and Rockford is very entertaining, as Jameson doesn't like Jim's sass.
Yeah, it's a pity we're not the same age. I could take you out behind the woodshed and we could bash it around for a while.
And Jim doesn't care.
Well, I don't go in for that kind of thing.
Did you see Mark?
Jameson convinces Jim to stay on the case, as he's convinced Chalmers has a dark secret and wants Jim to go to Newark to see if there's a, let's be honest, mob connection. Jim goes and gets no help from local law enforcement, but it looks like the cops are hiding something.
There's a private detective by the name of Jim Rockford in town. I don't want anyone identifying the photo he has of a man named Mark Chalmers.
He does manage to talk his way into a card game, but it turns out a late attendee to the card game is the very cop who is trying to hide information about Chalmers from Rockford. It's maybe a coincidence too far, but we soon find out from the two goons waiting in Rockford's motel room that Chalmers is surprisingly well known in New Jersey. There's a lovely moment in this scene where Jim addresses the silent goon.
Hi, how's it going?
That reveals so much about his character. Not only is he using humour to alleviate a tense situation, he's also letting these two thugs know he's not intimidated. Jim quickly returns to LA after this, and we return to the start of the episode. I was a little worried here that we were going to replay the whole opening, but thankfully it just transitions out of the flashback to present. The present-day goons return, and as they are driving him out to whack him, as I believe is the correct vernacular, the cops show up to stop them. Is this Becca to the rescue? Not this time. This time it's the feds, led by Agent David Shaw, played by James McEachin, who also appeared in two Columbos, Etude in Black and Make Me a Perfect Murder. Jim attempts a little information quid pro quo with the FBI, but they are keeping quiet, so he leaves just as confused as he was in Jersey. Back at his trailer, Rocky shows up and Jim nearly brains him.
Come in.
Oh, hi.
Rocky took a message from Jameson while Jim was having his mobster trouble, furious that Jim missed their appointment. So Jim calls him and we get this fascinating shot of Jameson with his pet bird of prey. And that wraps up part 1. I think this ending shows that the episode was never really meant to be split up, as it's not much of a cliffhanger. And so far what we've seen in the episode is very much the building up of story elements. There's the overprotective father who's hired Jim, some kind of mob connection on two coasts, and an FBI investigation, all centered around this Mark Chalmers character who we know nothing about. Part 2 begins with an extended recap of nearly 8 minutes, before we're thrown straight into the action as sirens wail and we find out someone's been shot. We then get a repeat of the scene of Rockford arranging to meet Jameson again, for the purposes of syndication, before they meet. Jim neatly breaks down the case for Jameson and his incredulity. Jameson denies knowing any more than Rockford, and the scenes between Cotton and Garner are the real highlights of the episode. Their back and forth is very entertaining, and as you'd expect, their performances are fantastic.
I believe I paid you for some information. Please recite it to me as quickly as possible and leave.
Jameson reveals that Chalmers confronted him about Rockford's investigation, so Jameson is ending the case, which doesn't help Jim, who now has the mob and the feds after him and still has no idea why. Jim is followed from his meeting with Jameson and another chase ensues. This one definitely goes on a bit too long for me, being 2.5 minutes long and taking place at night, making it difficult to see exactly what's going on. But once again, Jim outsmarts his pursuers. The next day, Rocky turns up to try to convince Jim to find a safer job, and Jim finds out that Rocky ate Jim's steak and eggs as payment for cleaning up Jim's trailer the night before.
I also had eggs in here, 3 eggs. What happened to them?
Well, I had steak and eggs.
In an unexpected turn of events, Susan turns up at Jim's trailer and wants to hire Jim to find out why Chalmers has broken off their engagement. Obviously, this creates an ethical conundrum for Jim, which he wants to deal with before he agrees to take the case. As he arrives back at his trailer, he's confronted by 2 more goons who have tied Rocky up and insists Jim goes with them. He naturally does and ends up even more confused by this encounter than ever.
Maybe someday when all this is over, you and I can have a beer and you can tell me what all this is about. Bye.
What I really enjoy about this show is just how confused Jim is by it all, and how his confusion helps the audience deal with their confusion. We don't have much of a clue of what's going on, but that's okay because neither does he. He finally decides he has no other option but to deal with the feds. He finds out that the last car that followed him was the feds and that Chalmers is a mob informant, or was a mob informant, as he was the man shot and killed at the start of the episode. Agent Shaw thinks the mob caught up with Chalmers, but Rockford has other ideas, which Shaw isn't interested in. Jim calls Jameson and tells him he thinks Susan killed Chalmers and arranges to meet Jameson. Before he can go to Jameson starts taking pot shots at Rockford. Jim is eventually able to get the better of Jameson and explains how he knew that Jameson really killed Chalmers, his overprotectiveness turning lethal. The episode concludes with Jim taking Susan out to dinner after her ordeal, followed by both the feds and the mob, apparently unable to get a break from this case. This is another very well-crafted story, one that doesn't repeat the structure of previous episodes, allowing us to see yet more aspects of Jim's character and how he interacts with different groups of people. The version I watched is overstuffed with extended and repeated sequences, shots, and recaps, but I can't really hold that against the episode. But it does do the show a disservice if you're only able to watch the 2-part version, as parts of it do drag. The performances are all great, as you might expect from the show, although there's not really enough of Sharon Gless to establish her character, and even though they note that it's 2 weeks later, it still feels a bit odd that she's going on a date with Jim at the end of the episode, especially after making a point about ethics earlier in the episode and how much she loved Chalmers. For me, the episode is a 5 out of 5, but the syndicated 2-part version is a 3 out of 5. I would definitely seek out the proper broadcast version if you can find it. Thank you. Goodbye.